Interestingly enough, when I went to request a key for Kingsgrave, I was expecting something a bit different than what it ended up being, which is actually a positive, since instead of a run-of-the-mill roguelite, it turned out to be an enjoyable little action game that sits a bit closer to classic Zelda titles, though with an interesting bit of a quirkiness and a material-based progression. Now, some of you might recognize the publisher, Alzorath, from some of my previous reviews, namely Wallworld and Necrosmith 2, both being fairly affordable titles with solid pixel art and an enjoyable gameplay loop. And Kingsgrave fits that mold, though thankfully with far less of a grind involved. Getting the blemishes out of the way first though, the only big ticket issue I ran into was a weird bug where some upgrades didn't lock in on my playthrough during the pre-release access, which prevented progression. Though it fixed itself on starting a new game, and despite restarting several times since then, I've not been able to reproduce the bug, even when I actively try to sequence break the game to force it. So I think it may have just been a me issue, especially since none of the other creators I talked to ran into it either. Now, in terms of the actual playthrough, I could see a first run taking maybe 8 to 10 hours, but if you know what you're doing, the game would be pretty easy to beat in much less than that, even with the occasional bit of grinding for materials needed to get to the end. This is sped up quite a bit thanks to there being a few cheese farming spots if you know what you're doing, and them being accessible at around the halfway mark. This shorter length is probably for the best since the story follows the principles of more early action and even some roguelite games, and keeps it simple and more implied rather than explicit, with story gotten in little bits and pieces amidst the progression, and essentially being a short story about your kingdom getting destroyed, the essence of life reviving you, and then your subsequent quest against the essence of death, with little outside of that for story bits, even from the townsfolk you rescue. This is fine though, since the gameplay is enjoyable enough, and it really is focused on scratching the itch mentioned earlier, namely a modernized take on games like the original Zelda, with hack and slash gameplay, power progression, and different methods of handling different types of enemies and bosses to keep you engaged. And it also has the ability to continue to explore your world after beating it, should you want to work for that 100%. I can also count on one hand the moments where the grinding itself felt like a proper imposition. In fact, the only part that felt like more of a hindrance was traveling between the purchase points for raw materials, since they were not in a central hub, but rather spread out in thematic locations, all with fast travel points, which is cool, but having to fast travel 3 or 4 times to buy all the components you need for a building is a bit frustrating. Though all said and done, those are some pretty minor frustrations, especially since the game does so many things right. It has a nice variety of weapons, each naturally doing a different damage type and being key to dealing with different types of enemies. For example, your starting scepter is only mediocre on slime since it's blunt damage, but it works great against bone enemies, while most weapons are completely ineffective against wood, but if you bring an axe or even some fire damage, they melt. There are even enemies that have immunities, like trees I mentioned being immune to a few weapons, or even shadowy enemies that require unlocking a specific holy upgrade for your weapons or getting your hands on lightning damage. So learning your weapons is actually important to progression because of how much it improves battles, even though I guess if you wanted to, you could brute force your way through about 2/3 of the game without doing so. But since there is a progression point that requires getting every weapon, you may as well try them. Even though a few, like the arrow, can feel a pinch cumbersome until you get some upgrades unlocked to speed them up. This design results in a bit less replayability compared to other Alzorath titles, but on the plus side, far less grind as was mentioned earlier. Pretty much the only things subsequent playthroughs could offer are completionist and speedrunning goals. And while there is a post-game, I didn't really find much desire to push through it, since it does feel like it's just there for completionists. Now, as far as difficulty curves, this could just be me, but it oddly felt like the game became significantly easier as I got further in rather than harder. This is fine, but I do always find it a bit odd when games start feeling like a pushover as I move into supposedly harder areas. Now, this could be tied to how I try to seek out cheese strategies and break games as part of my testing, but generally speaking, players will, unfortunately, usually optimize the fun out of their games, if given the chance anyway. This could also be due to the fact that progression is tied to a mix of kingdom development and puzzles, since outside of some runs to try and sequence break, I generally farmed up to finish a portion of the kingdom before moving on. so that I'd have all the tools possible when I encountered the various puzzles along the way. So maybe if you treated it more like a Metroidvania and tried to push the zone boundaries more, it would be a bit more difficult, but it wasn't like this grinding took an inordinate amount of time. The puzzle design was not much more difficult either as you progress, since a lot of it involved either using an item or ability at a specific location, or converting blocks with a specific type of attack on it so that you could unlock different paths, some rotational puzzles, but nothing too complicated. I think the only one I struggled with was some of the shield grapple puzzles, and that's mostly down to me just being really derpy with parry and block mechanics in, well, most games. Interestingly though, with the latest update before I got this out, most of this still holds true, but they did actually fix one of the few balance complaints I had with the initial release, and that was resources. Sure, you still have to do the bouncing to random places for wood or stone or whatever, but with the introduction of the Mushroom Cave and its subsequent building, it is now possible to farm for every resource in the game should you actually want to max out all of your gear, which previously did not seem really that possible, but you were free to refund and swap out upgrades. So overall, especially for the asking price, which is super cheap, this is a pretty solid little gem that can scratch a nostalgia itch for a weekend. Will it change the world or revolutionize gaming or even revive a beloved genre? Probably not, but not every game needs to. Sometimes you just want something fun to escape in that isn't going to suck away months of your life or turn into a second job, and Kingsgrave fits that bill perfectly.